Hi, everyone. This is our lecture on chapter 25 of the MacCulloch book, Culture Wars, the last chapter in this book. Next, we'll be moving on to the Sana book, Disciples from Every Nation. So, like I've done in the past, I'm going to occasionally glance over to look at my notes and try to walk you through section by section the main claims MacCulloch is making, trying to clarify some things you may not know, give some background, some context. So to dive right into it, we begin with the Second Vatican Council, also called Vatican II. MacCulloch calls it half a revolution, and we'll see why. In the beginning, we see that this Pope, John the 23rd, was not expected to live a long time, was not expected to be Pope a long time, and he was not. But he was not expected to do many things, to rock the boat, so to speak. And that actually he did by calling this Second Vatican Council and by addressing it and setting the tone for it. He was an older man, but he was very curious and open-minded, thinking about the world, the new world that he lived in, this 20th century world. And so he encouraged people, the bishops and the leaders of the Catholic Church that he invited, to think about it in the same way. And by inviting these 2,000 bishops, by inviting media attention, even by inviting women and Protestants, non-Catholics, to come to a Roman Catholic council, this is unprecedented. In hundreds of years of Roman Catholic councils, these kind of things have not been done. And it showed this kind of openness and made it very difficult for conservatives to manage. Conservatives wanted not much to change. It's hard to change an institution like the Roman Catholic Church because there's a lot of inertia. And the Pope wanted to change things, and conservatives tried to thwart him. But one of the key moves he made is basically internal politics. He found a very competent cardinal who knew Vatican politics, Italian politics, to help him manage everything. Added onto that, like I said, this guest list, which included thousands of bishops, women, Protestants, and it was difficult, really, for the conservatives to keep their agenda. So we see why it's called a revolution. Some of the aspects of this revolution we could see in Lumen Gentium. This is one of the documents that came out of it, and the point is that it de-emphasized what had been taught for a long time, which is that Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, is the only right branch of Christianity, the only way to reach salvation. There's still aspects of Roman Catholic teaching that do offer that, but more and more there's an openness to talking to other Christians, thinking about other Christians as possibly legitimate avenues or legitimate avenues to salvation, and even other religions, even more controversially, as possibly ways that reflect God's grace. And so these are changes. This is part of the revolutionary aspect. Another part is that Catholics apologized to Jews openly and bluntly, and they threw away an old medieval teaching that had hundreds of years of history of Jews being God killers, the ones who killed Jesus, who was God. And that was completely refused, hopefully, so that in the future there would be less anti Semitism associated with Christianity. Um, Now, in terms of revolution, one last kind of revolutionary period fact of the Vatican II was that it changed many hundreds of years of reaching back to uh, some of the earliest church history, the Latin church history, this kind of Latin mass that had been said in this sacred language, Latin, for hundreds of years, even more than 1,000 years. It changed it to the vernacular language. And what we mean by vernacular, this is an important point that will come up in our class again and again, is just common tongue, just the language we speak. So English in this case, or for many of you, whatever other tongues you may have spoken at home growing up or you hear around you in your atmosphere. And those are all called vernacular because those are spoken languages. Those are living languages used in societies, unlike Latin, which is really preserved mainly, especially by the Catholic Church. And so this is all revolutionary that people could understand the Mass, could understand the service in the language of home. God could speak to them, so to speak, or the priest could speak to them in their language that they recognized as their own birth language, the language they dream in. Now, why it's called half a revolution now is we could see, for instance, how Vatican II was implemented. It was implemented kind of poorly. It was from the top down and kind of forcibly enacted almost overnight to cause a lot of conservative backlash. And you can also see these conservative forces working in the church, for instance, on Mary. The Pope reinforced this devotion to Mary, which would cause a lot of Orthodox and Protestants and other Christians a lot of grief and stress and disagreement. Despite reaching out with an olive branch on one hand, Roman Catholicism reinforced its kind of teachings on Mary, which are unique to Roman Catholicism. And even many teachings that don't have a lot of historical basis were offered about Mary. Most strongly, probably, though, and most famously or infamously, Vatican II kind of took a very conservative position on human sexuality. It reinforced celibacy for priests, and it banned birth control even as being counter to God's plan. And with birth control, a whole raft or a whole series of other ideas on gender and sexuality you can imagine or you can understand. Basically, the more conservative line will be taken and will be encouraged because Vatican II sets that precedent. So that's why we call it half a revolution. It's a revolution, but in another sense, it's not quite a revolution. To move on to this section called Catholics, Protestants, and Liberation, we can see, again, some of these revolutionary ideas. So this whole section is on culture wars. We're going to see this kind of crystallization of Christianity in terms of left and right politics and social values, something that many of you may be very aware of. So this really brings us to the modern day, right? 2020, the 21st century. Christianity is involved in these both sides of many of these key issues that drive politics and social life in not only the West, but throughout the world. And so one of the ways we're going to see this is this kind of liberation theology, or versions of it, that seem to be on the side of oppressed peoples for both Catholics and Protestants. We see it in Latin America, where liberation theologians are specifically teaching that the proper Christian teaching should prefer the poor, should help the poor, and should be on the side of the poor, always the marginalized against the oppressors, the powerful. You see this in North America, in the United States, where people like Martin Luther King Jr. are also making arguments that Christianity, again, stands on the side of the oppressed, on the side of the ones who are denied justice, and that Christianity can motivate people to make great sacrifices and act bravely in the face of injustice, even without violence. And you see it also in Korea, so South Korea, in Minjung theology, which really opposes colonization, opposes some of the more destructive efforts or effects of capitalism and income inequality in favor of the people. Protests and quite a lot of bravery in the face of imprisonment and persecution from the government or from colonial powers. So in this period, in the modern period, really, the crucified Christ is especially inspirational. Christ, this is an image of Christ completely powerless, image of Christ completely marginal, made into a corpse even, and it speaks to a lot of people who are suffering from these kind of degrading circumstances of modern life. So, and one last kind of special case in which Christianity can be seen on the side of liberation in terms of politics can be seen in apartheid South Africa. So you can actually see Christianity operating on both sides here. Much of the apartheid regime, which is this particular regime of a very cruel and harsh form of racial segregation in which the minority of about 10% of white South Africans dominated the economy and were free to move about the country and about the world, whereas 90% of the black South Africans and colored South Africans were under very restrictive policies that forced them to live only in certain places and participate only in certain aspects of the country's life. And this was supported on one hand by these Dutch Reformed Christians, by this kind of overwhelmingly white Dutch Christianity spoken by these so-called Afrikaners in their language, Afrikaans. So Christianity, you could say, is on the side of oppression in some sense, but overwhelmingly, if you take a global view, that Christianity, excuse me, was against this apartheid system, both the Christianity of the blacks in South Africa and the Christianity of the world. And Christianity had a special role to play because this was the middle of the Cold War when apartheid was kind of at its peak and when it got overthrown. And because of the Cold War, a lot of governments were unwilling to basically speak against the South African apartheid regime. In terms of secular politics, politicians did not want to speak against South Africa because South Africa was a key kind of capitalist country against the tide of communism and socialism in Africa at the time, which was the main tension in the world between Russia or the communist kind of powers and the United States and capitalist powers. And so if the secular authorities had their hands tied, the churches were one of the most open places where South Africa could be criticized. And they did their best to ostracize the South African Dutch Reformed Church, to advise them, warn them, threaten them in any way they could that they were going the wrong way. And and that they were against the gospel, against the Bible, against Christianity. They even took practical steps. The book talks about a person who organized hundreds of millions of dollars in support for South Africans who were being jailed for protesting apartheid, for supporting their families, supporting these kinds of people. And the pressure, basically, the international pressure, sustained pressure that was put on South Africa through Christians and by Christians around the world. So this brings us then to another aspect of cultural evolution, or changes in human society, especially focused around the 1960s, although the effects of this have continued far past this. And the change, in some sense, this at the fundamental level, at one fundamental level, this change is about human biology and human technology. Basically, from the 1960s, we see and on we see the rise of reliable, cheap birth control with relatively little side effects. For the first time, perhaps in human history, there is a way for women, especially who have always borne the lion's share by far of the suffering and difficulty associated with pregnancy and birth, for women to take birth control and to manage their own bodies in a way that controls their fertility. And this has led, to a whole shift of kind of unexpected directions for human society as a whole, and of course for Christianity as a human phenomenon. And one of them is that families have shifted. Families have changed, right? From women being unpredictably and almost constantly pregnant in many cases, year after year, to being able to control the number of children, and the children becoming more precious because of that. And also the relationship between men and women changing because of that. So if women are constantly pregnant, it's hard for them to get educated, just practically. It's hard for them to engage in their own kind of professions and careers. It's hard, and men then de facto, kind of by default, become the public face, become the working one, become the source of financial success in the family or stability, the provider. With the change, with one or two children or a controlled number of children, it's possible for women to enter the workforce. It's possible for women to get an education, and the shape of the family changes, starts to focus on the nuclear family because they're having these children by choice, and these children are their entertainment, and even in a way the strength of the family leads to the family being the source of kind of moral right in a society. If you think about it today, you'd probably be more offended by someone telling you that they think it's okay, for instance, to abuse children or mistreat children, than for someone to say that they believe in a different God than you do, or a different version of God, or not, they don't believe in God. Now, you may think that this is, of course, or a matter of fact, but actually through most of human history was probably reversed. How you treat your children is not that big of a deal compared to if you subscribe or if you follow the right God, the correct God. And so this is changing, right? The strength of the family, paradoxically or maybe unexpectedly, is having an effect on the church that Christians may not have foreseen, which is that people focus more and more on the family as a unit of entertainment and moral instruction. They look to their own parents for directions in right or wrong, or they look to their own children in some ways for what's right and wrong in terms of how they should raise them and guide them, and not to the churches. The Sunday schools start emptying out and people stop going to church. They'd rather do family activities on weekends. And with this also comes divorce, because again, women are liberated, are able to support themselves, are able to be more independent, and the idea of marriage is changing. Instead of a union of families or a union of economic powers that with a dependent and a provider, it's more of a mutual relationship based on common understanding and interest, which can fall apart more easily. If you become bored, or you change, or your partner changes, you may want to dissolve this union. And so divorces are more prevalent, which is another problem for Christianity, which has traditionally opposed divorce. Also, along with these changes in human gender and sexuality, there's a greater acceptance or visibility for homosexuality, explicitly feminist kind of agendas, promoting the education and the equality of women, or the lessening of the traditional dominance of men over political and economic power in most of these societies. And then the churches will take all kinds of positions. So the first part that's covered in the book is more on the side, again, of the liberation thinkers, or these what we would consider now modern kind of left-wing type politics, the ones we've covered already, these kind of revolutions of the people, and also churches that are quick to ordain women, churches that are quick to embrace or to take away stigma related to divorce, quick to embrace the modern nuclear family or modern notions of familial harmony, even if they are not traditional. So after we finish with this group, though, we move on to the other group, kind of the other side of the kind of Christian world, this other side of the spectrum, the more right wing responses with this section called Old Time Religion, affirmations. And I really like how MacCulloch kind of breaks down the the reason why these kind of conservative religious extremisms, what he might call fundamentalism, what you might see in many kinds of religion, not just Christianity, but Islam, in Buddhism, in Sikhism, in Judaism. Basically, the modern one of the things MacCulloch points out, and I think is kind of true, is you see in some ways the differences between religions and between flavors of Christianity is less than ever based on it's less based on traditions than ever. It doesn't matter so much whether the history of Anglicanism or Protestantism or Catholicism, eh, or even in some ways the differences between some Christians and some Muslims is less important than the basic fundamental cleavage, which is, do you subscribe to a more left wing view in which you focus more on kind of affirming modern notions of gender, sexuality, new ideas or ways of creating family and social life? Or do you fall on a more kind of right wing view where you prefer these traditional, more conservative ideas of family organization, male and female, by birth, cis male, cis female, this kind of thing? And I do like how MacCulloch points out where a lot of this conservative thought is coming from. And he basically, it studies in general show that the people who are most reliably kind of conservative or even extremist in some ways in their religion, in various religious kind of environments, are young men who are educated and literate, but are jobless basically and don't have a place to apply their education, their intelligence. And so it's kind of, you could say these are kind of modernity's orphaned children, as he points out. The modern world has created them with general education, with the internet, with it's being easier than ever to access knowledge and learning and reading and these modes of thought from around the world. It's more possible than ever for someone to learn and to participate in these kind of conversations. So that's for the good on one hand, but for the bad is that neoliberal capitalism or the capitalist system that we live under has created a lot of joblessness. A lot of these people don't have jobs, are unemployed or are underemployed. They're not employed in jobs that seem meaningful to them. And with the lack of employment, often also comes difficulty in finding spouses, in creating status in their societies that they would have or expected to have. And if you look at most religions in the past, when literacy was much more rare, these kind of people would have been the leaders of society. There were not that many literate people. If you turn back the clock a couple hundred years, whether Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, these men, young men who have an education, would have been valued figures, would have found it much easier to find gainful employment, respect in society, spouses, all the kind of things they're looking for. And so you can kind of see this tension or an attractiveness to looking back to the past and saying, well, if we could go back to this earlier version of Christianity, if we could reboot it and get rid of some of these changes that have happened since the 1960s, put the genie in the bottle, my life would be better, or things would be better. And so this is really something I wanted to spend a little time on. And you can see basically these religious, like I said, these religious constellations forming strange alliances. So that maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, a conservative Protestant would have said the Pope is the Antichrist. But now conservative Protestants and conservative Roman Catholics have a lot in common in their opposition to, let's say, homosexual marriage, or their opposition to abortion. And liberals on both sides also will make common cause in their support of these kind of causes. So this really kind of cuts through a lot of these ancient divisions. In the United States, of course, you may be very familiar. I probably don't need to talk about it too much, but starting with the election of the evangelical Jimmy Carter, evangelicals and conservative Christians really come back after being embarrassed temporarily by the Scopes, as I said, the Scopes monkey trial and the failure of temperance. They kind of sit still or sit quiet for a few decades. But with Jimmy Carter, they're starting to come back. Jimmy Carter says he's a born again Christian, which seems like he should be their friend. But he's more on the liberal side of evangelicalism, the kind that pushed for abolition of slavery or desegregation. And he seems to their mind to have betrayed them because he opposes home schools, religious based faith schools, and also abortion. And so they really shift their allegiance to Reagan. So in a way, what we see with Trump is not unprecedented. Reagan is not clearly a Christian. He likes astrology and the star charts, and he's kind of more Hollywood spirituality. But he is reliable on abortion, on opposition to homosexual marriages and rights for people of non-conforming genders, sexualities. He's with them in these kind of things, and so they support him. And you see these kind of shifts occurring throughout basically America. And you also see it in the Catholic world with the election of John Paul II. John Paul II is a fascinating figure. He is very heroic in his opposition to communism and in his basically his support for many Eastern European peoples who have been dominated by atheistic communist Russia for decades. And he's a key figure in supporting them. But on the other hand, he also basically disagrees with Vatican II. And he has a very heavy hand, a strong hand in opposing teachings. He kicks out famous teachers that he doesn't agree with. He supports teachers that he does and even refers to more than any other pope before him and kind of setting a tone for future popes. This thing called the magisterium, which officially just means Catholic teaching, but he almost sees it as a person. The magisterium says, the official teaching says, listen to the official teaching. And he basically doubles down. He really agrees with the conservative elements of Vatican II, the kind of rejection of birth control, the rejection of other forms of gender roles and sexuality outside more traditional ones. And he calls it all a culture of death. Abortion, kind of homosexual family life or non-cis hetero marriage and family life. For him, it's all of a package of a culture of death that leads to death. And he includes in this also the death penalty and other things. But this also possibly caused him to really kind of have a blind eye towards some of the sexual abuse that the Catholic Church obviously is still dealing with, a legacy that continues to haunt the Catholic Church because of his conservativeness, because he was so worried about kind of defending the church against these kind of criticisms. And so we kind of come to the last section of this book, of this chapter and of this book, freedom, prospects and fears. The first half of this section talks about orthodoxy, and you can see basically, as I've hinted at sometimes in my class, one of the largest, possibly the largest mass conversion in history is when Soviet Russia falls, the Soviet communist government falls, and basically 100 million Russians are now officially Orthodox. And Orthodoxy is weaker than it was before Soviet Russia started, which kind of makes sense because it was kind of frozen in time for 70 years, while officially all of Eastern Europe and all of the kind of the heartland of Orthodoxy was officially atheistic. They're not going to be sending missionaries. The faith is not going to be spreading when the government officially doesn't even recognize it or is trying to squash it. But on the other hand, it's still quite vibrant. I mean, these people kept their faith alive over 70 years of government persecution. And no matter what you think about that, there's some obviously some interest there, some vibrance, some people buying into it. And you could see this, for instance, with I use these two polar examples, again, maybe right and left wing, of how popular it is. One is that you can see that KGB agents, Secret Service agents, really love the Russian Orthodox Church. Many of them are the ones who wanted to hold on most to Soviet Russia, central power, keeping the traditions alive. And after everything falls apart, the Russian Orthodox Church is the most Soviet institution that's left. It's actually, even though it was banned by the old government, it keeps alive these old traditions. And so the KGB lovingly restored an Orthodox Church, and a young KGB agent named Vladimir Putin, as I've pointed again out in class before, he becomes leader of Russia, and he maintains one of his great bases of power is his support of the Russian Orthodox Church, and they support him, and he supports them in turn. On the more, we could say, left wing or from the people, from the grassroots, and possibly revolutionary Christianity, is a widow, a simple Russian laywoman, not simple perhaps, very intelligent and very capable, but not associated with official power. Someone named Serafina, who became known as Mother Serafina, who takes a Russian convent that it's almost completely wiped out and reestablishes it, breathes new life into it as a widow for other women, especially for poor women, widows, refugee women, all kinds of women who, in a very patriarchal Russian society, still a very dominated male society, now have a place to create crafts, to create livelihood, to live, to support themselves with dignity, and nuns, new nuns. She inspires other Russian women to follow her into the convent and to take holy vows. So you kind of see Russian Orthodoxies, again, its vibrance from multiple directions. And the last half of this section kind of spans the world where we're going to be heading with the next book and shows how Christianity really is flourishing in Africa, where entire countries have been dedicated to Christ and called Christian countries officially. In China, where unexpectedly under the communist government, Christianity is growing very rapidly. In South Korea, where Christianity has reached a peak that it hasn't seen in other Eastern Asian countries. And even when one kind of Christianity kind of declines, like Protestantism, another kind of Christianity is now surging, which is Roman Catholicism in this case. So all these Christian groups, there's complex situations on the ground in every one of them. You can't overgeneralize, but we can see that there are both alliances and competitions between various Christian factions, like in South Korea, where maybe the loss of one group, Protestants, is the gain of another group, Catholics. Sometimes, other times, they make common cause so that Southern Baptists meet in Dallas and the Pope or sends a representative to bless them because they're on the conservative side. He's hoping that they'll make the same decisions as the Roman Catholic Church on abortions or on homosexual marriage, these kind of things. And these competition can even take darker turns, like in Latin America, where a Pentecostal general is basically committing genocide or at least murder, mass murder, in his attempts to solidify his control of Guatemala, killing a lot of other Christians, Catholics or indigenous Christians. And so it's complex. It's very complex in terms of alliances and competitions. And we'll get into that some, again, in the rest of this class. And probably the last note, one final note we can end on, is just talking about Christian ideas of hell. This is one giant shift throughout the whole Christian world, we can see. Whereas if you look at sermons and writings from even a couple hundred years ago, you see they're much more, even 100 years ago, they're much more focused on hell. There's a lot more discussion of hell, avoiding hell, the judgment of hell. And now it's hard, almost no matter where you go, right or left, to find people who really want to think about or talk about hell. In fact, there's a lot of energy spent on explaining hell away. And what is there to make of this? Well, we can go a lot of directions, but one is we can say that Christianity can change, even in its most kind of fundamental moral teachings. Hell is a very fundamental teaching for Christians. It's the other side of eternal life, and paradise is hell. And the fact that Christians don't want to talk about it suggests that just how much this religion can change over time in its emphases. And we shouldn't be surprised. We've seen quite a lot of changes already. And we'll see more in terms of cultures, different cultures embracing Christianity. But another thing we can see is that Christians are increasingly focused on this world. They're not as focused on the next world and waiting until the end. And it also shows that maybe they are less willing to cast moral judgment, less focused on punishment as the world modernizes and as the world in some ways becomes less bloody and less brutal, with less child mortality rates, with less wars, fewer wars. Maybe Christians are more uncomfortable than ever with these ideas of punishment. And so it's hard to say where Christianity will change. This is just one little snapshot. And why it's a nice note to end on is just to show the unpredictability of these things. We're doing our best in this class to cover and understand the world as it is, but where it will be and what Christians will believe in the future, right? The Christianity that I said, the demographic trends suggest that the world is staying at least as Christian, perhaps becoming more Christian than ever. But what that Christianity looks like, it's hard to predict and know. The kind of Christianity our children or that generation may interact with is very hard to understand and know exactly, because these things are changing so much and have so much potential. So thanks for staying with me through the first half of this class and this book. That's the end of this recording.